The air in the executive boardroom of Sterling Innovations was a thick, oppressive silence, heavy with unsaid words and mounting frustration. Sunlight, usually a welcome presence, felt cold as it streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing above the polished, obsidian-black mahogany table. At its head sat Mr. Harrison Thorne, the CEO, his impeccably tailored suit a rigid shell around his steely ambition. His face, usually composed, was etched with a polite, yet palpable, frustration. His gaze was fixed on Ms. Evelyn Reed, the head of marketing, who stood by a projection screen, her usual vibrant red power suit seeming to droop slightly. Her voice, typically smooth and confident, was now edged with a desperate tremor as she presented the dismal quarterly report, a tableau of declining sales and shrinking market share. The numbers on the screen glowed an ominous red, a silent accusation. Across from her, Mr. David Chen, the chief financial officer, remained impassive, a sentinel of stoic pragmatism. His rimless glasses reflected the grim projections without revealing an ounce of emotion. He adjusted his glasses with a precise, almost imperceptible movement, his silence more unnerving than any spoken criticism. The conversation was a low thrum of corporate jargon, thinly veiled blame, and the desperate search for solutions that continued to elude them. Suddenly, a sound, utterly out of place, sliced through the tension. The heavy oak door creaked open with a groan, and all heads swiveled. In the doorway stood Arthur Jenkins, the company's oldest janitor. His small, stooped frame was clad in faded blue overalls, perpetually smelling of industrial-strength lemon cleaner. His wispy white hair framed a face etched with wrinkles, but his eyes, despite their age, twinkled with a quiet, observant kindness. He clutched a dented gray plastic bucket in one hand, a well-worn, string mop trailing behind him, its damp head leaving a faint, glistening trail on the polished marble floor of the hallway. "Excuse me," Arthur mumbled, his voice a raspy whisper. He took a hesitant step inside, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the executives. "Just need to clean the whiteboard." A ripple of low chuckles spread through the room. Thorne, initially startled, quickly recovered, raising an eyebrow, a sardonic, almost pitying smile playing on his lips. "Lost Arthur?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock concern. Evelyn, mortified by the interruption, pressed a hand to her temple, her eyes squeezed shut. David Chen merely adjusted his glasses again, a tiny, almost imperceptible sigh escaping his lips, clearly annoyed by the delay. The executives exchanged knowing glances, a silent, unspoken agreement passing between them. The old man had clearly lost his way. Arthur, however, seemed utterly oblivious to their derision. His focus was entirely on the whiteboard. He shuffled forward, his worn-out work boots making a soft, rhythmic squeak on the marble. He set down his bucket with a gentle clatter, the mop handle leaning precariously against the table. The executives watched, a mixture of mild amusement and growing impatience on their faces. What was the old man doing? Was he going to erase Evelyn's crucial, albeit depressing, data? A ripple of confusion, replacing the amusement, began to spread through the room. Arthur then, with deliberate slowness, straightened up. He moved towards the gleaming white surface of the whiteboard that dominated one entire wall of the boardroom, its expanse still bearing Evelyn's frantic scribbles about market share and declining profits. He reached out, his gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble, and picked up a dry erase marker. Its black tip, stark against the pristine white, seemed almost significant in his hand. The room began to quiet, the executives' curiosity, against their better judgment, piqued by his unexpected persistence. Arthur held the marker poised for a moment, his gaze unwavering, then, with a confident, almost practiced stroke, he began to write. The first few lines were simple, almost childlike in their simplicity, but as he continued, a complex diagram, connecting seemingly disparate points with an unexpected and unsettling logic, began to emerge. The low chuckles had died completely. A profound, almost reverent silence had fallen over the boardroom, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of the marker against the white surface. Harrison Thorne, who had been leaning back casually, now leaned forward, his casual posture replaced by an intense, almost bewildered focus. Evelyn, initially annoyed, found herself mesmerized, her eyes tracing the lines Arthur was drawing. David Chen, usually impassive, shifted in his seat, a flicker of something akin to genuine fascination, or perhaps just profound puzzlement, in his usually unreadable eyes. The laughter in the executive boardroom had completely vanished, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to suck the very air out of the room. It wasn't a respectful quiet, but one born of utter, bewildered disbelief. Harrison Thorne, the CEO, sat bolt upright, his initial condescending smile wiped clean from his face, his gaze riveted on Arthur. Evelyn Reed, her earlier mortification now eclipsed by a strange, almost hypnotic curiosity, felt a prickle of unease. She shot a quick, pleading look at Thorne, a silent urge for him to restore order, but Thorne seemed frozen, his eyes glazed with perplexity. David Chen, the CFO, ever the pragmatist, actually checked his watch again, a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head indicating his annoyance at the absurd situation unfolding before him. Arthur, however, was a world away from their internal turmoil. He remained utterly oblivious to their derision or their silent demands for him to simply disappear. His focus was singular, absolute, a quiet intensity that defied his humble appearance. With deliberate slowness, he continued his work. He walked to the gleaming whiteboard that dominated one entire wall, its pristine white surface still bearing Evelyn's frantic scribbles about market share and declining profits. He picked up a dry erase marker, its black tip a stark, almost defiant contrast against the white. The soft click as he removed the cap was surprisingly loud in the hushed room. And then, he began to draw. His hand, though gnarled and age-spotted, moved with a surprising precision, a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his stooped posture. He wasn't just sketching idly, he was constructing. The first few lines were simple, almost rudimentary, but they held an underlying purpose. He drew a large circle, then began to divide it into sections, labeling them awareness, consideration, purchase. These were standard terms, familiar to every executive in the room. But then, Arthur connected them with lines and arrows that twisted and turned in unexpected ways, not following the linear, predictable flow their meticulously crafted presentations always depicted. As he continued, a complex diagram began to emerge, growing organically. He added smaller circles within the larger ones, connecting them with dotted lines. He drew a crucial point where their current sales funnel, according to his drawing, seemed to abruptly implode, a stark visual representation of their current customer retention crisis. It wasn't just a breakdown, it was a gaping hole. And then, with a stroke that seemed almost revelatory, he drew a series of interconnected pathways that bypassed this breakdown entirely, a subtle alternative route that circumvented the catastrophic failure point. He began to label new nodes with terms that were startlingly familiar to the executives, yet arranged in a way they'd never considered, never visualized: customer flow, product journey, bottleneck identification, post-purchase engagement. The only sound in the vast boardroom was the rhythmic scratching of the marker against the whiteboard, a surprisingly loud, almost hypnotic sound in the profound silence. Each stroke, each newly formed line, seemed to pull the executives deeper into Arthur's unexpected creation. Thorne, who had been leaning back slightly, his arms crossed, now leaned forward, his casual posture replaced by an intense, almost bewildered focus. He tried to mentally categorize what Arthur was doing, to fit it into a known business model. But he couldn't. It was something new, something unsettlingly intuitive. Evelyn, initially annoyed, found herself utterly mesmerized. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, traced every line, every arrow Arthur was drawing. She was a marketing expert, a master of consumer behavior, and yet, the simple, almost crude lines Arthur was sketching resonated with a raw truth that her elaborate data models often obscured. She felt a growing, unsettling sense of recognition. This wasn't just random scribbling. There was a logic, a flow, an almost organic intelligence to it. She caught herself leaning closer, her breath held captive in her chest. David Chen, usually the most impassive and analytical in the room, found himself utterly stumped. He was a master of financial models, a wizard with spreadsheets. This wasn't a standard business model he was observing. It was something else, something primal. He found himself shifting uncomfortably in his seat, a flicker of something akin to genuine intrigue, or perhaps just profound confusion, in his usually unreadable eyes. His analytical mind, accustomed to precision and quantifiable data, struggled to process the unexpected intuition unfolding before him. Arthur finished his last stroke, a small, elegant curve that completed a feedback loop. He capped the marker with a soft, final click. He then turned slowly to face the stunned executives, his blue eyes twinkling with a knowing, almost mischievous glint. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. The silence that followed was absolute, thick with anticipation. No one moved. No one spoke. The whiteboard, now a canvas of unexpected genius, glowed silently behind him, a testament to the power of observation. And for the first time since Arthur had walked in, not a single person in the room was laughing. Arthur continued to draw, his hand moving with a surprising precision. The rhythmic squeak, squeak, squeak of the dry erase marker against the gleaming whiteboard was the only sound in the profound silence that had fallen over the boardroom. Each stroke was deliberate, purposeful, adding another layer to the intricate web of lines, arrows, and symbols rapidly taking shape. He wasn't just sketching, he was constructing a detailed, intricate tapestry of interconnected ideas. The executives, once a picture of corporate detachment, were now completely captivated. Their initial skepticism had morphed into an intense, almost bewildered fascination. Harrison Thorne, the CEO, felt a strange pull, a reluctant acknowledgement that what was unfolding before him transcended the mundane. Arthur meticulously drew a crucial point on the board, a central nexus labeled Customer Journey Implosion. It was a stark, almost brutal visual representation of where Sterling Innovations was failing. Then, with a flourish, he sketched a series of interconnected pathways that bypassed this breakdown entirely, a subtle yet profound redesign of their customer interaction process. He added more labels, his script surprisingly clear, feedback loop integration, proactive problem resolution, and, most strikingly, emotional touchpoints. These weren't terms from their business textbooks. They felt organic, intuitive, drawn from a place of deep, empathetic understanding. Arthur even drew a small, simplified human face at various stages of the customer journey, smiling at awareness, frowning at implosion, and finally, a subtle, contented smile at the end of his proposed resolution pathway. It was crude, yet incredibly powerful. The scratching sound of the marker was the only noise, and with each passing moment, the tension in the room coiled tighter. Thorne, who had been trying to maintain control, found his composure unraveling. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, staring at the board, a deep, almost painful crease forming between his brows. This wasn't just an interruption. It felt like a silent, profound indictment of everything they had been doing. Evelyn Reed, the head of marketing, was no longer just mesmerized. She was experiencing a growing sense of revelation. Her eyes darted across the board, tracing the lines Arthur was drawing. The bottleneck he had so clearly drawn, the point of customer loss, she knew it. Her recent focus groups had hinted at it. But Arthur had visualized it with a simple, elegant clarity that cut through all the corporate noise. What is that?" she whispered, the words barely audible, a plea to herself to understand the enigma unfolding before her. David Chen, the stoic chief financial officer, usually so quick to dissect any financial model, found himself utterly stumped. His analytical mind, accustomed to complex spreadsheets, struggled to grasp the raw, intuitive brilliance of Arthur's diagram. It wasn't quantifiable in the way he understood. It was a qualitative leap, a diagram of human behavior and emotional response, depicted with a simplicity that made it terrifyingly effective. He shifted in his seat, the subtle movement betraying a rare flicker of unease. Arthur finished his last stroke, a final arrow pointing towards a redesigned loyalty loop. He capped the marker with a soft, decisive click, the sound resonating like a gavel striking wood. He then turned slowly, methodically, to face the stunned executives, his gaze sweeping across their faces. His blue eyes, deep-set and surprisingly piercing, twinkled with a quiet satisfaction, a knowing glint that suggested he had anticipated their reactions all along. There was no arrogance in his posture, just a calm, almost humble certainty. "That," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the thick silence like a scalpel, "is how you fix your customer retention problem. And your stagnant growth. It's how I would do it if I were in charge." The words, delivered without pomp or pretense, landed like a thunderclap. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the gathered executives. Harrison Thorne's jaw clenched, a muscle working furiously along his jawline. His face, usually so controlled, showed a flicker of shock, then perhaps indignation. Evelyn's eyes widened in disbelief, her breath catching. David Chen, for the first time, allowed his impassive mask to slip, a flash of pure astonishment crossing his features. This was more than just an interruption, it was an audacious challenge. A direct, unvarnished critique from the most unexpected source. The janitor had not merely presented an idea, He had laid bare their corporate failings with an undeniable visual clarity. And for the first time, not a single person in the room was laughing. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound. It was the heavy quiet of minds grappling with an impossible reality, of assumptions shattering, and of an undeniable truth that had just been scrawled on their whiteboard by the man who cleaned their floors. The power dynamics of the room had irrevocably shifted. The heavy silence that followed Arthur's audacious pronouncement hung in the air, thick with unspoken questions and shattered assumptions. Harrison Thorne, the CEO, usually quick to assert his authority, found himself utterly speechless. His carefully constructed composure was momentarily broken, leaving a rare vulnerability. He stared at Arthur, then at the complex, almost alien diagram on the whiteboard, trying to reconcile the janitor with the genius. Evelyn Reed, head of marketing, her initial frustration long forgotten, continued to stare at the whiteboard. A flicker of something unreadable played in her eyes. Was it recognition? Was it a dawning sense of shame that a janitor had seen what her highly paid teams had missed? Or was it, more powerfully, a spark of hope? It was David Chen, the stoic chief financial officer, who finally broke the spell, his voice low and cautious. "Arthur," he began, his usual clipped tone replaced by an almost tentative inquiry, how did you come up with this?" He adjusted his rimless glasses, but for once, the gesture seemed less about habit and more about masking genuine, uncharacteristic uncertainty. Arthur merely smiled, a knowing glint in his blue eyes. "I've been watching," he said simply, his voice raspy but firm. "Watching your customers, watching your processes, watching you." He gestured subtly towards the boardroom. "From the outside, you see things differently." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You're all looking at the data, the numbers," he continued, gesturing again to Evelyn's grim projections, "but you're missing the human element. The subtle cues. The complaints overheard in the restroom. The frustrations mumbled in the elevator. The patterns in the wastebaskets." He paused again, his gaze steady, almost unervingly direct. "I see what's broken because I clean up the messes." His words, delivered without malice, were devastating in their quiet truth. Thorne cleared his throat, a weak attempt to regain control. "Arthur," he said, his voice attempting to regain its usual authoritative cadence, though it now lacked conviction. "While we appreciate your unique perspective, I assure you our analysts are highly skilled. Our market research is exhaustive." He tried to dismiss it, but the image on the whiteboard made his words ring hollow. Evelyn, however, took a decisive step closer to the board, her marketing brain alight with frantic recognition. She reached out, her finger tracing a line on Arthur's diagram. "The bottleneck here," she murmured, almost to herself, "that's exactly what our recent focus groups indicated. We saw the numbers, but we couldn't visualize it like this. We couldn't connect the human experience to the data in such a clear, immediate way." Her words, delivered with a mix of awe and frustration, were a powerful validation of Arthur's impromptu lesson. A ripple of low, murmuring discussion began to spread among the other executives, no longer mocking, but tinged with hesitant curiosity. They began to lean forward, whispering, pointing at various parts of Arthur's diagram. The simple lines and shapes, so easily dismissed moments ago, now held an undeniable, almost magnetic power. A seed of doubt, and perhaps a flicker of desperate hope, began to sprout in their minds. Arthur had indeed seen something they hadn't. He had seen the truth from the ground up, a perspective entirely alien to their top-down, spreadsheet-driven world. The janitor, it turned out, was not just a cleaner of physical messes, but a clear-sighted observer of systemic ones. And in that moment, the power dynamics of the room, once so rigidly defined, had subtly but irrevocably begun to shift. The corporate giants were, for the first time, truly listening to the quiet man who simply cleaned their floors. The initial shock in the boardroom slowly gave way to astonished questions. The executives, their faces a tableau of disbelief and burgeoning curiosity, began to pepper Arthur with inquiries. No longer was there condescension. It had been replaced by a grudging, almost desperate respect. Harrison Thorne, ever the opportunist, could practically smell the potential. Evelyn Reed, her marketing brain buzzing with new possibilities, was genuinely intrigued, her usual cool demeanor replaced by an almost childlike eagerness. David Chen, the CFO, already trying to translate Arthur's intuitive diagram into quantifiable metrics, began to scribble notes, a rare deviation from his usual detached observation. "Arthur," Evelyn asked, her voice softer than it had been all morning, "how long have you been observing all this? These insights, they're incredibly detailed." She gestured to the board, then to the vast expanse of the office building, as if comprehending the sheer scale of his daily, unnoticed surveillance. Arthur chuckled, a dry, gentle sound in the sterile, high-tech environment. He leaned against the whiteboard, his gaze distant for a moment. "Long enough," he said simply, a wistful look crossing his face. "Before this, I worked in manufacturing, you know. Back in the day. Saw a lot of inefficiencies there too. Different scale, perhaps, but the principles, they're much the same." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the executives' rapt faces, seeing their hunger for answers. "Before that," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, a note of quiet reminiscence entering it, "a lifetime ago, it feels like now. I was an engineer." The words, delivered so casually, yet with such profound weight, hung in the opulent air of the boardroom. Designed systems. Built things. Solved problems. The revelation landed like a quiet thunderclap. An engineer. The word echoed in the executives' minds, a stark, jarring contrast to his current humble profession. Harrison Thorne's eyes narrowed, a different kind of calculation beginning to churn in his mind. This wasn't just a janitor with an interesting hobby. This was a man with a hidden past, a suppressed intellect. The implications were immense, unsettling, and undeniably exciting. Evelyn's jaw dropped slightly. David Chen's pen, which had been furiously scribbling, paused mid-sentence. An engineer. It wasn't just intuition, it was structured thought, a trained mind. Arthur, seemingly oblivious to the seismic shift his words had created, moved on, pointing to another section of his diagram. "This here," he explained, his finger tracing a newly drawn pathway, "is where you optimize the post-purchase experience. Most companies, they think the job's done once the sale is made. But that's where you lose people. That's where loyalty dies." He looked at Evelyn. "It's not just about selling a product, it's about fostering loyalty. It's about making people feel heard, valued, even after they've bought what you're selling. It's about turning a transaction into a relationship." He gestured to the customer journey implosion point he'd drawn earlier. "That's where your customers feel abandoned. They get stuck in automated phone trees. They wait days for an email reply. They feel like a number. They get frustrated, and then they leave. And they tell their friends. And then you lose not just one customer, but a whole network." His words were simple, direct, yet they carried the weight of countless observed interactions. The room was no longer just silent, it was captivated. The executives were hanging on Arthur's every word, their skepticism replaced by a profound sense of having stumbled upon something invaluable. Thorne's mind was now racing, not just about the numbers, but about the story. The janitor, it turned out, was far more than met the eye, and his insights, born from years of quiet observation and a past life of complex problem-solving, were proving not just valuable, but utterly transformative. The questions continued, rapid-fire, each executive eager to probe deeper. The janitor, it seemed, was cleaning up more than just dust. He was sweeping away their outdated notions of corporate strategy. The discussion in the Sterling Innovations boardroom stretched on, the rigid corporate schedule utterly forgotten. The atmosphere, once thick with scorn, was now electrified with a raw, almost frantic energy. Arthur Jenkins, the unassuming janitor, patiently explained each component of his intricate diagram. He illustrated his points not with abstract theories, but with surprisingly relevant anecdotes gleaned from his daily observations. The emotional impact of a customer service call, the subtle satisfaction of a well-maintained office, the hidden patterns in employee morale discovered in whispered conversations. His wisdom was empirical, drawn from the ground up, unfiltered by corporate jargon. Harrison Thorne, the CEO, his initial skepticism now entirely dissolved, found his ambitious mind whirring with possibilities. He saw not just a solution to their immediate problems, but a powerful, compelling narrative, a story that could revitalize Sterling Innovations' image. The janitor genius could be a marketing coup. He cleared his throat, commanding attention, his voice now imbued with a renewed sense of purpose. "Arthur," he began, his tone completely devoid of any condescension, replaced instead by a respectful, almost deferential quality, "this is remarkable. Truly remarkable. We'd like to offer you a temporary consultancy role. A special project focused on implementing these insights. The words felt foreign on his tongue, an unprecedented offer to a man who, until moments ago, was simply a cleaner. Evelyn Reed, her face glowing with genuine enthusiasm, nodded vigorously. Her marketing instincts screamed that this was not just good strategy, but good storytelling. This was authentic. David Chen, the CFO, offered a rare small smile that barely touched his lips, but in the context of his usual stoicism, it was practically a cheer. His spreadsheets, even from his brief calculations, were already showing projections of significant ROI. The numbers simply didn't lie. Arthur paused, a thoughtful expression settling on his face as he considered their offer. He looked from Thorne's eager, calculating eyes to Evelyn's hopeful ones, and then to David's stoic but now undeniably receptive gaze. He understood the offer was both an immense opportunity and a significant test. It was a chance to finally prove his theories, to put his lifelong observations into action. But it was also a risk, a chance to be co-opted, to have his organic, human-centered approach subsumed by the very corporate machinery he was meant to fix. He remembered the feeling of being overlooked, of his ideas being dismissed in previous lives. This was a chance to finally be heard, to truly make a difference, but at what potential cost to his own quiet independence? He looked at the executives, at the polished mahogany table that represented their world, and then, subtly, at his mop and bucket, still leaning against the wall, a poignant symbol of his own. A flicker of something passed through his eyes, a memory, perhaps, of past disappointments. But then, a resolve solidified. This was his chance. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering as he met Thorne's eye. "But on one condition." Thorne's broad, triumphant smile wavered, a hint of his old authority, his old wary skepticism, creeping back in. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with a condition being placed by a janitor. "And what might that be, Arthur?" he asked, his tone now carefully neutral, bordering on demanding. "I get to choose my team," Arthur replied, his voice gaining a quiet but undeniable force. He swept his gaze across the room, encompassing not just the senior executives, but the stunned mid-level managers and junior associates who had been silently observing the entire extraordinary exchange. "And I work directly with the customer service and sales teams, not just in this boardroom. I need to be on the ground. I need to see the real interactions, the real challenges, not just the data filtered through layers of management." The executives exchanged nervous glances. Thorne's jaw tightened. This wasn't just brilliance. This was shrewdness. This wasn't just a janitor who could draw diagrams. This was a man who understood power, influence, and the critical importance of operational autonomy. He was demanding a level of control that even some senior VPs didn't possess. To give him direct access to frontline staff, bypassing established hierarchies, was a radical, almost unthinkable proposition. It was a complete disruption of their structured world. But the alternative, to let this unique opportunity slip away, to continue down the path of stagnant growth, was becoming increasingly unpalatable. The ball was now firmly in their court, and Arthur had just raised the stakes considerably. The silence that settled once more was different this time, a tense, calculated quiet, pregnant with the weight of a monumental decision. Arthur's new, albeit temporary, role at Sterling Innovations sent ripples through the company. The hushed whispers of "janitor consultant" initially circulated with amused disbelief, a corporate joke in break rooms and elevators. How could a janitor truly understand their global corporation? Yet, those who saw Arthur in action quickly changed their tune. The amusement curdled into grudging respect, then into awe. He held unconventional meetings. Not in polished boardrooms, but in bustling break rooms, echoing hallways, and cavernous loading docks. His team wasn't comprised of analysts, but of the very backbone of Sterling Innovations. Frontline customer service representatives, disillusioned sales associates, and even fellow janitors. He encouraged them to share their frustrations, their unheeded ideas, their daily observations, the small, human data points that algorithms often missed. Arthur was a sponge, soaking up every complaint, every suggestion, every raw emotion. He had an uncanny knack for truly hearing what was said and, more importantly, what was left unsaid. He didn't offer grand pronouncements. He simply listened, absorbing the collective wisdom of the often overlooked. Then, with quiet efficiency, He began to implement simple, common-sense changes. Faster, personalized follow-up calls to customers. A system for employees to anonymously report recurring customer issues, creating a direct pipeline from the ground up. He even championed minor adjustments like ensuring break rooms were spotless, recognizing the subtle psychological impact on morale. Harrison Thorne, initially skeptical of Arthur's ground-up approach, watched the numbers slowly start to shift. Customer retention, once plummeting, began a steady, undeniable climb. Positive online reviews, once a rarity, became more frequent. Evelyn Reed found her marketing campaigns suddenly resonating more deeply, fueled by Arthur's grassroots insights. David Chen, the CFO, his spreadsheets now showing undeniable, quantifiable improvements, could no longer deny the efficacy of Arthur's methods, even if they defied conventional corporate wisdom. The data, the irrefutable data, was singing Arthur's praises. But Arthur's methods, while effective, were also profoundly disruptive. His insistence on direct communication, his bypassing of established chains of command, and his empowerment of frontline staff directly challenged the authority of middle management. Whispers of insubordination, overstepping boundaries, and anarchy began to reach Thorne's ears, carried by disgruntled department heads whose carefully cultivated power bases felt threatened. They saw Arthur not as a genius, but as a rogue element, dismantling the very structure they had spent years building. The corporate machine was designed for hierarchy, for control, for predictable processes. Arthur was introducing a wild, unpredictable variable. The tension in the company began to mount, a quiet civil war brewing beneath the polished surface. The middle managers began to actively resist Arthur's initiatives, subtly sabotaging communication lines, delaying approvals, and spreading dissent. The janitor consultant became less of a joke and more of a threat. Thorne, caught between the undeniable financial success Arthur was bringing and the growing internal unrest, found himself in an increasingly untenable position. He was receiving daily reports of disruption and morale issues from a powerful faction of his executive team. Finally, a crucial board meeting was called. It wasn't on the official agenda, but every executive knew its true purpose: to discuss Arthur's disruptive influence and, more likely, to decide his fate. The atmosphere in the boardroom was palpable, thick with the weight of this impending confrontation. Thorne, his face grim, pressured by disgruntled department heads and the rigid expectations of the old guard, knew he had to deliver a verdict on Arthur's unconventional tenure. Arthur stood before them, calm and collected, his shoulders slightly stooped, his blue eyes taking in the scene. His gaze swept over the room, from the scowling, indignant faces of the middle managers who felt their authority challenged, to the anxious, hopeful expressions of Evelyn and David, his unlikely champions. The very future of Sterling Innovations, and Arthur's place within it, hung precariously in the balance. The stage was set for a showdown, a clash between the rigid old ways and the radical new path, all hanging on the words of a simple janitor. The boardroom was a powder keg, thick with suppressed anger and nervous anticipation. Harrison Thorne, grim-faced at the head of the table, cleared his throat. "Arthur," he began, his voice strained, "while your contributions were insightful, your methods have caused considerable disruption. We need a more structured approach." The formidable middle managers nodded vigorously, a mix of vindication and relief on their faces. But before Thorne could continue, a sharp, clear voice cut across the silence. It was Evelyn Reed, who rose with a decisive, almost defiant movement. "Respectfully, Mr. Thorne," she interjected, her voice firm, "the numbers speak for themselves. Customer satisfaction is up 20% in just 3 months. Sales leads have converted at twice the rate. Arthur's methods aren't disruptive, they're revolutionary." She gestured emphatically towards the projection screen, now displaying charts of undeniable growth in vibrant green. Before the disgruntled managers could protest, David Chen chimed in, surprising everyone. He adjusted his glasses, his voice calm but firm. From a financial perspective, his strategies have yielded an unprecedented ROI. "The disruption you speak of, gentlemen, is merely the shedding of inefficient, outdated practices." A heated debate erupted then, a chaotic clash of ideologies. The traditionalists roared their objections, arguing for hierarchy and order. But arrayed against them were the unexpected champions of Arthur's pragmatic genius. Evelyn, armed with marketing success, David, with unassailable financial data, and a growing number of younger executives who had seen the revitalization Arthur brought. Thorne, caught in the corporate tempest, finally raised a hand for silence. He looked at Arthur, and in that moment, a flicker of true admiration crossed his face. He saw not just a janitor, but a man of profound wisdom and unwavering integrity. "Arthur," he said, his voice softer now, "what do you propose we do? What is your vision for Sterling Innovations?" Arthur smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. He didn't grandstand. His voice was steady, infused with a quiet conviction of years of observation. "I propose we continue doing what works. Empower the people closest to the customer. Listen to them. Trust them." He then looked directly at the middle managers, his gaze compassionate. "And teach them to listen too. To see the value in every voice, no matter where it comes from." It was a call for fundamental change, a transformation of Sterling Innovations culture. In the end, Thorne, swayed by the irrefutable evidence of success and the unexpected loyalty Arthur had inspired, made a bold decision. He rose from his seat. "Arthur Jenkins," he announced, his voice ringing with newfound resolve, "effective immediately, we are creating a new, permanent, senior position, Director of Customer Experience and Operational Efficiency. The role is yours." Arthur, however, simply shook his head, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But my place is on the ground. My purpose is to see what others miss." He glanced towards his mop and bucket, still resting quietly by the wall. "I'll consult, I'll advise, and I'll work with the teams directly. But I'll also still clean the floors. It keeps me connected. It keeps me grounded. It helps me see." And so, Arthur Jenkins, the janitor who had walked into a boardroom filled with laughter, who had silenced executives with a dry erase marker, continued to work at Sterling Innovations. Not as a symbol of corporate revolution, but as its quiet, ever-observant conscience. Sterling Innovations thrived, its growth now driven not just by data and spreadsheets, but by the profound understanding of human connection and the often overlooked truths found in the quiet corners of the company. Arthur cleaned their floors, but in doing so, he swept away their outdated notions of success, leaving behind a legacy of loyalty, efficiency, and profound, human-centered innovation. What would you have done in Arthur's place? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. This story of Arthur Jenkins shows just how important seeing value where others don't, and trusting in unconventional wisdom really is. Follow our channel for upcoming videos and remember to activate the notification bell.